before setting out what today's limud Be'ezer Hashem will be ma'ayanin, we'll make a preamble. In HaChovel, which we just recently learned in Daf HaYomi, we had a sugya on Daf Tzadik Aleph Amud Beis in Bava Kama of the isser of a person to be chovel ba'atzmoi. The Gemara has a shakla v'tarya that a person is not allowed to do a ma'aseh chavola on himself. And the Rishonim explain that this din of osir la'odam lachbol ba'atzmoi doesn't just represent an isser mitzad isurim, but the Gemara is actually establishing a limitation in the baalus, a limitation in the proprietary rights that a person has on their guf. We find as early as a tshuva in Rimigash that the Rimigash explains a dover pele, that the reason why there is a din of ein odom mesim atzmoi rosha, that a person cannot be moide in bezdin to something which would then obligate bezdin to give him an oynesh of either malchus or misa. The reason is, says the Rimigash, is because a person's guf is not birshusai to allow his guf to undergo chavola, and effectively him being moida on himself would be the equivalent in dinei mominus of him being moida on someone else. And the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, in the beginning of Hilchas Niskei Guf, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav says the following lashon. He says the reason why a person cannot allow reshus, he cannot give over the rights for someone else to be chovel in him, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav says, is because ki ein la'odom reshus al gufoi klal. A person does not have reshus on his guf in order to be able to allow his guf to be violated. And this is brought la halacha in a tshuva of the Rivash. The Rivash discusses in Siman Tov Pei Daled whether or not a person can allow his Baal Choiv to be able to take action against his physical guf in the event that he defaults on the repayment of a Choiv. The Rivash discusses a case where a Baal Choiv allowed his malveh to be able to take possession of his guf in the event that he defaulted on the Choiv. And the Rivash again establishes the same yisoid that a person does not have proprietary rights to his own guf, such that he cannot transact any reshus to be given to someone else to have kayach over his guf. Now, given that introduction, we can then ask a basic question in Dinei Shomrim, which Kamaduma is first discussed explicitly in a tshuva of a kadma in the Mari Katzvi, which Rabbi Kiva Eger brings in the Gilyon, as we'll see in an Indian unrelated to Shomrim, where the Mari Katzvi, as we'll see, brings a Tshuvas HaRadvaz, where the Tshuvas HaRadvaz attempts to establish a Machloikis HaRishonim, if it's possible to create Chiyuvei Shomrim on the guf of a person. In other words, we know that an Eved certainly is nismayet from Chiyuvei Shomrim. That's a sugya that the Olam has learned. But that's because an Eved has a din of gufoi konui. And therefore there are proprietary rights over an Eved that would allow an Eved to be given over to a Shomer. But the assumption is, and we'll see Be'ezer Hashem as we proceed, that the Chazon Ish makes this point clearly, that Dinei Shomrim would seemingly, from the Riyatas HaSugyas, be dependent on a person having certain Dinei Momon in whichever object he wants to give over for Shmira, and only on the grounds of those Dinei Momon can he give over the Chayfetz for Shmira. And therefore, in the same way as we've seen that even a person himself doesn't have proprietary rights to his own guf, we could argue that it isn't possible to give over a person to a shomer such that the shomer would be obligated in chiyuvei shmira towards that person. This will be, Be'ezer Hashem, the question that we will try to be ma'ayin in this limud. And the nafkiminas, as we'll see, are a number. For example, if a parent gives a child over to a carer, is there chiyuvei shomrim such that if the carer is pesheya and the child comes to harm, are there chiyuvim mitzad dinei shmira? Meaning that even if midin dinei nizokim, there was no act that the caregiver did which would be considered either mazik biyodayim or even possibly a groma. But pshia in shomrim doesn't require even a groma. It requires negligence in the chiyuvim of shmira. If we can establish that a parent has certain rights over a child, and those rights would be sufficient for the child to be given over to a shomer, then we can establish chiyuvei pshia in negligence of shmira of a child.
Isn't a person a shomer socher over his own body and a parent a shomer socher over his child?
Why would there be a shomer? The Be'er Shalom was? So we established in the preamble that a person primarily has no rights. What's a shomer? Because he has use of it. Okay, but the same way as hektish is beigazad derachmana, and you have no rights on hektish, maybe you have no rights on your guf either. So we'll be ma'ayin. Another application would be where, in the case of a parent to a child, we can discuss what rights a parent has to a child, as we'll see as we proceed through the limud, the Tshuvas Chasam Sofer, which touches on that issue. But what about an adult giving over themselves to be under the shmira of someone else? What would happen if a person is going to be a chayla and wants someone to care for him? Can they give themselves over to be nishmar by someone else? And so too, if there is someone who is incapacitated and someone is responsible for their care, can they give them over to a shomer and create chiyuvei shomer? I'm sorry? Oh, so we'll see Be'ez Hashem that will be a shayla, that the achronim will be down. What about ba'al avimai? And again, that clearly depends on the first shayla. It would depend on the bailus of the guf, how that would express itself in shmira, and would that create a din of ba'al avimai? So the limud begins with seemingly a machloikes which addresses this very point. I apologize if the Olam doesn't have the Maramakomis in front of them. We'll read out as best as possible the relevant lashonis of the poskim. There's a Ramah in Siman Kuf Ayin Vav, which is not in Dinei Shomrim, where the Ramah brings the following din. Misha sholeach chaveiroi ba'asokov v'nitfas. Someone who asked someone else to be his agent to carry out business for him. And the shliach was arrested. So the Ramah says, Yesh oimrim dim holach b'shviloi b'chinom. If the person has agreed to act as an agent on his behalf, pro bono, not in return for a compensation, in that case, chayiv lifdoisai. The meshaleach would then be obligated to pay for the release of his agent. And the lashon of the Ramah is, dehave olov kishoyel shechayiv ba'insim. The seeming lashon of the Ramah is that the shliach, since he's doing it pro bono, it's as though he has loaned himself to the meshaleach, in which case the meshaleach then becomes a shoyel on the shliach, and he is chayiv ba'insim. Namely, even though tfisa would be considered perhaps even a greater oinus and listim mezuyon, the Ramah brings one daya, which is based on the Mordechai, and we'll see the lashon of the Mordechai in a moment, that he's chayiv. Then the Ramah brings another shita, which is a b'shem the Ramban in Tshuvas HaMiyuchasos v'yesh cholkim. And there are those who argue on this chiyuv of oinsim, where a shliach was nitfas. Now the actual lashon of the Mordechai, which is based on a Mordechai in Bav Metzia, suggests that there is a din of she'ela on the gufa adam itself. The Mordechai's lashon is nearly din Shimon holach shom b'shlichusel shuruven v'nitfas. Then the zok the Mordechai chayiv ruven lifdoisoi de she'ela shayich beguf bailim de afal gav deloy have mamish doime bedoime. Even though this doesn't seem to be entirely equivalent to she'ela on a behemoth, for example. Why? De beguf ha'odom loy shayich geneva va'aveda. it's not possible for a person to ever be stolen or to be lost. And therefore we would have said that perhaps, unlike a chayfetz, where Geneva v'aveda is possible, since by an Odom, Geneva v'aveda is not possible. So perhaps, says the Mordechai, Parashas Chiyuvei Shomer wouldn't be said by an Odom. The Mordechai said that doesn't make a difference. He says, Mikol mokoim nire, kedeporech perek hamad de Sanhedrin, mali choyvel begufoi, mali choyvel b'mamoinoi. There isn't a difference between a chiyuv as it pertains to Mammon, namely Chiyuvei Shomrim, or a chiyuv as it pertains to the gufa adam. So even though the particular nature of a gufa adam doesn't allow all aspects of chiyuvei shmira, geneva v'aveda is not possible, says the Mordechai, but where what is relevant, avada would invoke chiyuvei shomim. So seemingly, I'm sorry? Yeah, we'll get to that, Beis Hashem. Correct. V'siyata d'shmaya will reach that. Me'idach gisa, the Ramah brings a chaylik, and the chaylik is a tshuva hamiyuchestes laRamban. Now, the key point to note in the Ramban is that the Ramban omits a discussion of Shomrim and only discusses the question of whether or not the Meshaleach should be obligated in the pidyon or the loss that the Shliach undergoes from the aspect of the dinim of Adam HaMazik. So the Ramban says the following. He says, Ein ha-Meshaleach chayev b'tashlumei nezek ha-Shliach. Why? Says the Ramban, Shaloi motzinu tashlumei nezek ela b'nizkei atzmoi or b'nizkei mamoinoi. We only find that the person is obligated in nezek either through his own act or through the specific arba avos which are mechadesh a parasha of nizkei mamoinoi. But here says the Ramban, by virtue of sending the shliach, he did nothing b'yodayin. His mammon is not involved. The most we can say, says the Ramban, is a groma, and groma ben azakim is potter. That's the essential maskana of the Ramban. And he says, Ve'elu dvarim pshutim heim. Va'afilu toimar shebegram shlichus higiyu nezek, groma benezek hu upoter. So seemingly, if we read the Ramah kipshutoi, where the Ramah first brings the Mordechai that there is she'ela begufoi, and that would be mechayev oinsim, and then the Ramah brings a yesh cholkim, it would seem kipshutoi that the Ramah is understanding that by virtue of the fact that the Ramban only anticipates a possibility of being mechayev the Meshaleach mitzad mazik, but doesn't mention the issue of Shmira, which then obviously wouldn't have any of the issues of the Ramban, that it's not mazik biodayim, it's only a groma, because that's what Parashas Shomrim establishes, that where there's chiyuvei Shmira and there is chiyuvei oinsim, then groma is not a factor. That's exactly what Parashas Shomrim is mechayev. Memele is not the Ramah that there is a machlokes between the two. Yes. Well, that's the mechayev. That's the mechayev on the goinev, because he is being goinev nefashos. But to say that the person becomes a nignav, that we can't say, because the person fundamentally remains b'shus atzmai. The only chiyuv that you would have to pay for him, in the way the Mordechai understands, is the fact that he's nitfas means he's not free, so to speak, to use himself. Meaning we're looking at him in his state of being in incarceration as being useless. I'm sorry?
Even though the person is not nignav, the goynev would still be chayav.
Well, it's not that the goynev would still be chayiv. It would be that as a result of the fact that he was nitfas, it's as though the person has been deprived of his own use. So the same way as if an owner lends an object to someone and it's nenas, which means its owner lost its effective use, someone who's being mashal himself and is then nitfas is then not able to function for himself. So he has been deprived, so to speak, of his own functioning. That is the basis, and we'll come back to define that more precisely, of being mechayev and oinsim. And the Marik in Tshuva Kuf Lamed Aleph quotes an additional Mordechai, B'Shem Rabbeinu Meir, where the Mordechai B'Shem Rabbeinu Meir seems to have this very discussion, whether or not it's possible to be mechayev and chiyuvei sheila, a meshaleach towards his shliach. And the Marik reads the Mordechai, and we'll come back to it later in the Limud B'nei Neder. The Marik reads the Mordechai that the maskon of the Mordechai is that there is no chiyuvim of the meshaleach towards the shliach. There may be only a chiyuv to be poideh mitzad dinei tzedakah, And then the Mordechai goes on to explain that if the shliach would be a relative of the Mishaleach, which is the particular case of the Mordechai, there may be a din that he has to be koydem to be poida him because of karav koydem. But fundamentally, the Marik derives from the Mordechai that the Mordechai concurs with the Das or Ramban that there isn't an issue of chiyuv shemim, there is only an issue of chiyuv mazik. Now let's use this diun in the Rishonim, the way we've presented it so far, to try and ask three basic shemim shailas, two of which the Olam has already touched on, and the third is the shaila of the Nesivos. The first question is, that was asked before, it's shmira b'bailim. Harry, if we will assume that the person can be mashal himself, then like one of the Lomdim just asked, ein lecha shmira b'bailim gedolim izu, that the bailim of his own guf is always nishal together with the guf. Harry, we have a chiddush in the Mishnah in the beginning of Ashoel, Hishoel li lemelocha imparasi, that creates she'ela b'bailim. But l'chayra ein lecha she'ela b'bailim godel mizeh, that the very object that's nishal is the bailim of the object itself. This is the first shaila which the Achronim ask. The second shaila which one of the Lomdim asked is if, as a result of the shlichus, he was nishba, then that should be meisam achmas melocha. And the shaila is potter on that. That what happened was, the way the Mordechai explains the case, is he was hoylech b'shlichus and he was nishba. He was nitfas. Meisam achmas melocha. The third shaila is, it's a person. Avodim hukshu l'karkois. And we know that there's a nidin in the Rishonim if avodim hukshu l'karkois applies only to an eved, or it applies also to a ben chayrin. A machloikis primarily between Rashi and Tosfos in the beginning of Masechta Kiddushin. So l'chayra of this din of the Mordechai that he was mashalas atzmoi should be dependent on the machloikis Rishonim whether or not a ben chayrin is hukash l'karka. These three shaylas are asked by the Nesivos on that halacha in Siman Kufa Vav. To those who are following the Maramakomis, it's on the second sheet of the Maramakomis, bottom right. The Nesivos sets out three shaylas on this din, to summarize. Firstly, shmira b'bailim. Secondly, meisam achmas melocha. And third, that an odom is hukash lekarka. These shaylas are discussed actually by Achronim earlier than the Nesivos. And by being ma'ayin in the Achronim who are discuss primarily the shayla of shmira b'bailim and the shayla of meisam achmas melocha, perhaps we will come to understand other ways of interpreting this loshen of the Mordechai, that there's a chiyuv of oinsim machmas, that he was mashal es gufay. The Tshuvas Mabit, it's copied on the second page of the Maramakomis, top left, to those who are following in the Maramakomis. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, I'll mention the Lashonis. The Tshuvas Mabit, in discussing this shaila of a shliach being obligated in what befalls his shliach, the Mashalech being chayiv in what befalls his shliach. So the Mabit brings both the Ramban and the Mordechai, and the Mabit says that be'emes there is no machloikis between the two. They're just describing two different scenarios. The Mabit says it depends whether or not the misfortune befell the shliach as a direct result of him being put in the position of being the shliach for his mishaleach, or was it coincidental to the shlichus? And the Mabit explains the following. He says that when the Rishonim say that the Mashalech is potter, he says, Hainu, that case is, Kishahuzak, Shaloi machmas ha-Mashalech v'loi misibasai. Because it happened coincidentally. It was nothing to do with the fact that the Mashalech sent him or that he was on the Shlichas. Kigoin, he says, in Nishba Baderech, he was captured on the way. Zok the Mabit, She'im gam hu ha-yohelech derech sham, if he himself would have had reason to go there for his own purposes, the same thing would have happened to it, namely that that particular road or route is dangerous. Therefore, says the Mabit in that case, Einoi b'sibas ha-Mashalech v'lochein einoi chayiv. But he says, im derech moshel, those who incarcerated him, it's because they had some issue with his Mashalech previously, and therefore he was incarcerated as a direct result of his Mishaleach. In that case, says the Mabit, in that case, Im Hashavoim hu yusoinim l'Mishaleach, then he says, Have kamoi poisheya b'shliach. That establishes the pshia of the Mishaleach in the Shliach, because it was directly the Mishaleach that caused the Shliach to have been victimized. And he says, Ki misibosoi nishba. That's what the Marik says. Now, the Olam will notice, and the Loimer that asked this before, the Shail of Mesa Machmas Malacha, that this seems to be paradoxical. We would have expected the exact opposite. If it was Besibas HaMeshaleach, then Adrabah, that's Mesa Machmas Malacha Mamish. If it was Shaloi Besibas HaShaliach, Adrabah, that should be Mechayevim. We'll see that the Chasam Sofer momentarily will actually say, because of this reason, the exact opposite to the Mabit. But what's relevant to the Mabit is not so much the Mabit's understanding of Mesa Machmas Malacha, but how the Mabit understands the Loshen of the Mordechai, that the Mishaleach becomes a shoyel on the Shliach and therefore is chayiv. And he says the following. He says, because Kihani Gavne, in those cases where it was the Mishaleach who caused the Shliach to have been the victim, Yechayiv Kihu Kimoishe Poishea La Shliach, Venucha Loimar, says the Mabit, Ki Mashekosa Bagos Mordechai, Shechayiv Lifdoisoi De Sheilo Shaicha Begufa Bailim, Hainu b'chi ha'igavno shenishba machmas ha'meshaleach.
Isn't that mamish the Svar of the Ramban?
The what?
Isn't that mamish the Svar of the Ramban?
That-
Is Malacha
Yes, the Mashal.
the Shul didn't inform the Mashal didn't
Oh, so let's see. We don't know. In other words, it's an excellent shaila, and we'll get to that Beis Hashem. The shaila of the Mabit doesn't make it clear, or let's say the tshuva of the Mabit doesn't make it clear what level of negligence there was in terms of what the shliach knew. So we'll get back to that Beis Hashem. That's a point that I didn't find in the Poskim that discussed the Mabit until an Achron Zmanenu, the Pischei Choshen, who mentions this issue in the Mabit that you raised. But possibly there's earlier, I just didn't see. But this is an issue which Beis Hashem will try and get back to. It seems that the Mabit is understanding that when the Mordechai says Poishea Begufai, he doesn't mean Chiyuvei Shomrim. He means Mazik. And therefore, the same way as the Mabit makes the Ramban and the Mordechai consistent, and says the reason why the Ramban is Poiter is because it's regardless of the Meshaleach, and the reason why the Mordechai is Mechayiv is it's because of the Meshaleach. And he understands that the Ramban would concede that if it would be directly caused by the Meshaleach, there would be Chiyuv Mazik, namely, that the Ramban only exonerated the Meshaleach because he called it Groma, but where there was a direct sending of a Shliach into a situation where the Meshaleach will cause him to fall victim, that would, according to the Ramban, constitute Hezek. Says the Mabit, when the Mordechai discusses Havalei Shoyel Begufoi, the Mabit seems to understand that doesn't mean literal She'elah. What it means is that the Meshaleach is liable because he, through negligence, has caused the Meshaleach to befall what befell him. So it seems from the Mabit. But often that we seem to have from the Mabit that it's no longer muchach simply that the Mordechai means literally Chiyuvei Einsin, which would seem to be somewhat a doichak in the lashon of the Mordechai, but that's what's mavur in Shuvas Mabit. Why the Mordechai emphasizes Pshia? Yeah, right. That's an excellent point. The reason why the Mordechai emphasizes Pshia is because, as we'll recall, he says because Geneva v'Aveda is not possible by an Adam. So therefore, the only mechayev in the case of Nishba would either be considered Pshia, or, as we'll see a lashon of the Chuvas Arosh, as though the person was Nishbar. But the Mordechai using the lashon Pshia Kipshuta is just is lafuke Geneva v'Aveda. Memele zok the Mabit. There's no machloikis fundamentally between the Ramban and the Mordechai. They're describing two different scenarios. Me'idach Gisa, the Chasam Sofer says exactly the reverse. And the Chasam Sofer says the hepech should be true. If it was machmas hashliach, then it's mesa machmas malacha. And if it's not machmas hashliach, then adrab, in that case he's chayiv. So the Chasam Sofer in Tshuva doesn't bring them a bit, but the Chasam Sofer in Tshuva, when discussing a similar shaila of the obligations of the Mishaleach towards what befell the Shliach, Zot the Chasam Sofer, that there's no machlokes between the Ramban and the Rashba. Each one is describing a different scenario where one has the P'tur of Mesa Machmas Malacha and one doesn't. Now what's relevant in Yonenu is what the Chasam Sofer then continues in the tshuva, and he says the following to those who are following the Maram HaKaimis. It's bottom of left on page 2, just to read out briefly the lashon of the Chasam Sofer. He says the following. He says, we asked another question on the Mordechai. What about the din of Ba'ol of Imoy? One of the Lomdim asked the Shaila. Hare ein lecha Ba'ol of Imoy Godel Mizu, that the Nishal is the Dovar HaNishal itself. So Zot the Chasam Sofer that he saw in the Tshuva Shtei Lechem, it's a tshuva of a Kadmoin, where the Chacham Tzvi addresses the Shaila, and the Chacham Tzvi says a Yesod. It's only possible to have the P'tur of Ba'ol of Imoy where the Bailim and the object which is part of the Sheila are distinct. He says the Chasam Sofer, since it's Gzeres HaKosuv that there should be a P'tur of Ba'ol of Imoy, the Rishonim don't give us a clear understanding of what the logic of that din is. Therefore, he says, Hovu d'loi loisif Allah, that we can only apply the din of Ba'ol of Imoy in the case where there's Ba'ol of and the Dover HaNishal. But where they're one, then we don't have the P'tur of Ba'ol of Imoy. Azay zok the Chasam Sofer, and he says the Makor is a Chacham Tzvi. Memele zok the Chasam Sofer, what would be in the following case? He says, Ulefize mishem muskar etzel balabais, someone who is hired by a balabais. V'yesh lo lahasoicher bas ktana. And the soicher, the hired hand, has a daughter who's a ktana. It's an important point that she's a ktana. V'balabais sholcha b'chinom. And the employer asked the daughter of his employee, could you do a shlichus for me? And then what happened was, v'ira lo hefsid begufa. And she underwent some type of damage. Zot the Chasam Sofer, he says, in that case, there would be a din of Ba'ol of Imoy. The Balabayis is Muskar, and now the Bas is She'ula Bechinom to his employer. So here we have a case of Ba'ol of Imoy. So the Chasam Sofer has been Mechadesh a Chidush Nifla, that a father on a Bas Ktana has proprietary rights that allows him to transact a she'ela on his bas. And he says now it will have an afkimina how we answer the nesibas shaila of Ba'ol of Imoy. If we answer the shaila the way the Chasam Sofer quoted from the Shtei Alechem and the Chacham Tzvi, that the answer is because we need Ba'olov and we need the Chayfetz, and that generates the P'tur of Ba'ol of Imoy, then Zot the Chasam Sofer, there isn't Ba'ol of Imoy in the case of the Mordechai, but there's going to be Ba'ol of Imoy in a case of an Av towards his Bas. And the Chasam Sofer explains that where is this from? Where is this derived from? That an Av has proprietary rights in his Bas. Says a Dover Nifla, the Chasam Sofer. He says, Kiven shehabas nikna la'av min atayr le'moichra le'oma. So there, since an Av has a schus bebitoy le'mochra, and that's good for why he's goyve hezekim with sugin achayva that we learned. Memele zot the Chasam Sofer, if he has proprietary rights in his Bas, he can establish a she'el on her. Now, we would just pause for a moment and therefore say that in the case of a ben, well, we don't have that same din. Rashi in Yevamis tells us, Chaskinov brings it many places, that Akum has a schus bebonov. But by Yisrael, we don't find that same din, even though there's a chiyuv of demei v'lodois. But the Achreinim explain, Baruch Ber brings V'Shem Reb Chaim, in Ber Hashmul and Bava Kama, that that's because of the hefsed of an isha, because an isha with v'lodois has a different shavius. But there isn't necessarily a bailus in the guf havlodois. And it's not clear, and we'll come back to this in a short while, what schusim an Av has bebonov in terms of proprietary rights. So perhaps a person, L'fi the Chasam Sofer, would have enough of a bailus to be mashal himself, which would not have a p'tur of Ba'ol of Imoy. An Av in his bas has a schus and a koyach to be mashal, to create a p'tur of Ba'ol of Imoy, where he himself is sochor, And in a ben, we'll still discuss. Homios, what we have in the Chasam Sofer is that the Chasam Sofer understands the issue of Ba'al of Imoy exactly the opposite of the Mabit, whereas the Mabit understood that if the Meshaleach was Goyrem, that's the case where the Mordechai was Mechayev. The Chasam Sofer understands the opposite if the Meshaleach was Goyrem. Memele, there's a din of Ba'al of Imoy. And in fact, Rabbi Kiva Eger in the Gillian is mitzayin to a Tshuvas She'eris Yosef, it's a tshuva of a Kadmon, where there the She'eris Yosef discusses also this shaila of the chiyuv of the Meshaleach towards his shliach. And there are hagois that were written by the person who published the Sefer She'eris Yosef. And there's a kuntras, which is called the kuntras She'eris Yaakov. For those who want to see, it's on the first page of the Maramakamis, bottom right, where the She'eris Yaakov says that based on this Chacham Tzvi, which the Chasam Sofer brought, that we don't have a p'tur of bol of imoy where the object and the bailim is one. Zok the She'eris Yaakov, we could possibly suggest that that is the basis of the machloikes between the Mordechai and the Ramban. The Hainu, that both the Ramban and the Mordechai fundamentally agree that there's a concept of being mashal aguf. Just says the She'eris Yaakov, Bezen nechleku, in this svara mechudeshes of the Chacham Tzvi, that we don't have ba'ol of imoy where the bailam and the object is the same, that's a machlokes harishonim. The Ramban that doesn't address at all dinei shoimrim is not because he disagrees with the concept of she'ela on the guf, it's because he's already assumed there's a p'tur ba'ol of imoy, and therefore the only issue will be an issue of chiyuv mazik. Whereas the Mordechai is choylek, and the Mordechai says we don't hold of this svara, that where it's beguf echad there's no din of ba'al of imoy. And Mela, the Mordechai approached the shayla mitzad the dinim of Shem. So if we summarize the point which we've reached so far in the limud, we began with the machlokes between the Mordechai and the Ramban, benegeh to the chiyuvim of a meshaleach towards a shliach, where the straightforward reading of the Mordechai seems to be that the Mordechai is being mechadish a concept of chiyuvei shoimrim on a person being mashal himself. To that concept, we have a Chasam Sofer who understands the machlokes is based on chiyuvei shoimrim, and the Chasam Sofer understands that the Ramban and the Rashba are just describing two different scenarios where there is or isn't a p'tur of ba'al of imoy. But both Rishonim, both the Ramban and the Mordechai, have assumed that fundamentally there is a Parsha Shoimrim. We saw a Tshuvas She'eris Yosef and the Kuntras She'eris Yaakov, which makes the same assumption that all agree that there's a concept of Shmira on the Gufa Adam. And the Machlokes is, in this Svara itself, is there a P'tur of Bol of Imoy where the Nishal and the Bailim are one? However, we had a Mabit, that the Mabit seems to be Yivur Mitoich Dvarov, that his understanding of Pesher Begufoy in the Mordechai is Mitzad Dinei Mazik, and in which case, according to the Mabit, we do not have a clear makor in the Rishonim that there's actually a concept of She'ela Begufoy. So here we have a Dovar Nifla, which Rabbi Kiva Eger in the Gillian is mitzayin to, and Rabbi Kiva Eger brings a tshuva of the Marikatzvi, a Kadmon, where the Marikatzvi, as we mentioned, brings a loshon of the Tshuvas HaRadvaz. For those who are following the Maramakomis, it's top right on page 2, where the Tshuvas HaRadvaz says that the machloikes between the Ramban and the Mordechai is whether or not it's possible to establish chiyuvei shoimrim on a guf adam. Bezen nechelku. In exactly this point. Is it possible to establish chiyuvei shoimrim on a guf adam? Dayan on an adam ben chayron, and Eved obviously we can. Can one establish chiyuvei shoimrim? And the lashon of the Ramban is, and he says, the homotzinu she'ela ba'odom kemoi bebali chayim. The Radvaz is discussing whether or not there's possible she'ela on a person, and he says, why should it be different than a Baal Chai? And the proof is, he says, the Radvaz in Tshuva, is from the Mordechai, from Av Shesholach Es Benoi. And he says, on the other hand, the Radvaz brings that the Ramban that argues seems to say that there's no concept of she'ela. So this fundamental shaila of can we have she'ela on a gufa adam like any chayfetz is shani according to the Radvaz in Imachlokes Harishayim. This is what Rabbi Kiva Eger is mitzayin in the Gillian. Now, perhaps we can be ma'ayin for a few moments in what's mavur in various sugyas to this basic shaila of can there be chiyuvei shemrim on the guf adam? Kipshuto, we have two sugyas mefurashos that there's shayach shmira on the guf adam. The first is a sugya in Bab Metzia on Daf Nun Ches, where the Gemara in Bab Metzia Daf Nun Ches discusses the din of shmira on karka, or the din of or shmira on either the machlokes harishonim whether or not it's shmira on karkois, or the din is, I'm sorry. So in he says the machlokes harishonim. He says the machlokes. You're saying b'negeh to the din of Eid Olam Achai. How do we? Which Radvaz? Yeah. So we'll come back to explain the Shittas Radvaz more bar Chav in just a moment. But the Gemara says the Gemara brings a brisa. Hasoicher es hapoel, lishmor es aporo, lishmor es hatinoik, lishmor es hazroim. And the Gemara discusses when and when not his chiyuvei shmira are. And the Gemara says, a noisen loy schar Shabbos, which is a din in schar Shabbos, that he can't be given. Some microphone that fell, I'm not sure if that was. He's not given, so the Gemara says he's not given schar Shabbos, and therefore, on the Yom HaShabbos, where he's not paid for his shmira, he's not mechuyev to be shomer. That's what the Gemara says. The Gemara's shakla v'tari on that brisa that the Gemara discusses that this doesn't seem to be consistent with dinei shomrim, the Rishonim explain is because of the din of lishmar es hazroim. Where lishmar es hazroim, Rashi explains means to be shomer zroim which are growing in order to bring for menachas. And the Gemara's question is either because there's no shmira by karka, and this is mechubel karka, or because it's hefker, how is there shmira on the davar shel hefker? That's a nidin in the Rishonim. But the Rishonim don't seem to point out that the Gemara has any question about the validity of being a shomer on a tinnik. What are we talking about? We're talking about that when the parah was, and part of the seder of the Maisa parah is that children were kept b'tara in order that they should bring mayim for the kiddush ha'ifeh. So the Gemara says that the gizbar would give over the child for shmira, and there's chiyuvei shomrim on that. So the Gemara in Bava Basra seems to have clearly, the Gemara in Bava Metzia, in Daf Nun Ches, seems to clearly have a case where there's chiyuvei shmira on a tinnik. Secondly, a very familiar Gemara. The Gemara in the end of Bava Basra, in Kufay and Gimel and Bais, the Gemara has a shakla v'tari where we learn the dinim of Orei from. And the Gemara has a havamina that where do we learn the dinim of Orei from? From Yehuda. Where Yehuda said to Yaakov Avinu, Anoichi e'ervenu miyodi tevakshenu. An orvus for having given over Binyamin to be taken by Yehuda. What koyach did Yaakov Avinu have over Binyamin that allows him to establish what's called the din of hoitzi hoitzois al piv, such that the chiyuv of orvus? And the Shiltei Giborim Afanot points this out. He says, we know that there's a Gemara in Kiddushin of 10 mona leploini v'akadosh ani loch. You can give away money. There's also a din, which is a machlokes rishonim, of zroik mona layom. And therefore I'll be chayiv to you. But there has to be some bailus by the person who's giving away his mammon in order to obligate the orev. So how does Arvus take place? What did Yaakov relinquish in terms of a koyach they had? First of all, Binyamin was a godel, and he was a ben. So are we going to say perhaps koydem matan Torah, like Bnei Noach, there was a schus and a din in Bonov? There seems to be oifanim in which, as the Shiltei Giborim points out, that there are oifanim in which shmira can be given over on a person. Seemingly there are two sugyas mefurashos. I'm sorry? Yes, but what's he being paid for? What's he being paid to do? The Gemara says because he's not being paid Shabbos, so therefore he's not obligated in Shmira. In order for him to be paid and to be obligated to be paid and commensurate to that, to have to engage in the responsibilities of Shomrim, there has to be some Chiyuv Shmira. has to be some parish of Shomrim. So we see to have two sugis mufurashos. Shmir. I'm sorry. Yes. Correct. Binyamin was a godel. Binyamin. So what does Anochi Erevenu mean? So we'll conclude the limud just with this point. We began mentioning b'shem the Chazon Ish that should be poshut, that one can only transact chiyuvei shomrim on something in which one has a koach mammon. And therefore we asked that even in a cotton, what schus mammon is there? By a ktana, the Chasam Sofer told us perhaps av moicher is bitoy la'omo. By a cotton, by gedolim, what schus mammon can be established? So the Chazon Ish himself, as brought by Remichel Yehuda Lefkovich in the Sefer in Bava Kama on Daf Tzadi Gimel, and the similar svara we find in the Stipler in Bava Metzia in Simon Lamed Gimel, that both of them qualify. Remichel Yehuda actually brings it b'shem the Chazon Ish, and the Stipler says it midaitoi. They both qualify the yisoid of the Chazon Ish, and they say, and this is a very broad-ranging yisoid, that the bailus that one must have in order to establish shmira, the proprietary rights in an object, in order to establish shmira, does not have to necessarily be limited to actual proprietary rights. If there's a financial interest in the mishap that would occur to the object, then that establishes the rights of shmira also. This is what the Remichel Yehuda brings that he heard from the Chazon Ish, and the Stipler says the same svar. The Stipler's proof is from this Gemara in Bava Metzia Daf Nun Ches, that one can establish shmira on a cotton. Remichel Yehuda's proof is because there's a Gemara in the end of Achoivel in Bava Metzia Tzadi Gimel where a gizbar of tzedakah can obligate, according to the one tzad in the Gemara, can obligate a shomer on the mois of tzedakah. And the Gemara brings a mute that there isn't obligations of tzedakah from a specific zes hakosu. But in terms of fundamental chiyuvei shomrim, it's hainuach. Memele zok the Chazon Ish, in a case where there's financial interest in there being a hezek. Okay, thank you. So Memele zok the Remichel Yehuda b'shem the Chazon Ish, and as we mentioned, the Stipler says the same svara. That the koyach moment that one needs in order to be able to establish shmira doesn't actually require proprietary rights in the object itself. It requires a financial interest in the well-being of the object. And therefore, we find, says the Stipler, a number of cases where we can establish chiyuvei shmira, despite the fact that we can't establish a conventional absolute schus mammon or bailus that we would ordinarily encounter. And one of the rayas, as we mentioned, that the Stipler brings is from this sugya of lishmar es hazroim, lishmar es hakotam. What's the logic? The logic would seem to be that since a father would have to be merape his ben, luyetzuyer, something befell him, so therefore, in the same way as the Stipler says, the reason why lishmar es haktanim is a shmira is because hekdesh for Maisa Para has to maintain the children b'Taira, and if the child would be nitma, then, says the Stipler, hekdesh would have to be tereach to bring other children, they would have to be matayr them, and so on and so forth. Therefore, they have an interest in preserving Taira, and that's the shmira. Therefore, we could by extension say that so too, a father who would then be obligated in ameliorating any nezek which would occur to a child, would therefore have an interest in the safety of the child, and could establish chiyuv shmira on the child. Mm-hmm. Oh, what about Simcha Shulchan? I'm not sure if I'll have time to get to that, but that Simcha Shulchan is actually discussed in the Mordechai that we brought from the Marik. If an Av sends his son, would the din change when they get to Simcha Shulchan? Perhaps we'll have time to get back to that.
So every person would have a din, a monetary aspect in Nezek. Pay Nezek for every person. So the person himself owns the monetary application of his Nezek. Correct. So that's correct. That's what we're going to get to. That's what we'll try and get to. But let's first, we began that one of the applications would be an application of giving over a child by a parent to childcare. So whereas the Chasam Sofer,
Correct. That's an excellent question, and that gets to the heart of the inyanim of shomrim. And we mentioned that earlier in the limud. When we come to be mechayev shomrim, we're not coming to be mechayev shomrim because there is a appreciable nezek which is directly in the pshia. The pshia is the pshia. What allows me to establish chiyuvei shomrim is my monetary interest, but that's the preamble to the shmirah. But once monetary interest allows me to establish shmirah, my claim against the shomer is not the loss of my interest. The claim against my shomer is the object. But what allows me to entrust him with it and obligate him for the safekeeping of the object is my interest in the object in the first place. That's the difference between the two. This yisoid, which both the Chazon Ish and the Stipler establish, has really opened the sugya much broader now than we understood it. The Mordechai seems to say that, and that's the quote that we had from the Mari Katzvi, B'Shem the Radvaz, where both of them discussed, can we create a parallel between Shmir on a Behema and Shmir on an Adam? The Radvaz says, can we compare a Behema to an Adam? Can we not? The Radvaz said that's the machlokes between the Ramban and the Mordechai. The Mordechai discussed whether or not, since Geneva Vaveda is not possible. The way it seems to be mavur from the Sugim Bab Metzia Daf Nun Ches, an interest in something allows us to establish chiyuvei shmira because that allows one to be mafkid what one has biyad someone else. There are two ways, if we want to sharpen the svara, there are two ways to understand that svara. The Stipler understands it that the monetary interest that one has establishes a certain degree of bailus. The Chazon Ish understands the svara the way Michal Yehuda brings it a little differently. It's not so much that it establishes a limited bailus vis-a-vis shomrim, but the Chazon Ish says that whenever the mafkid has obligations, he can obligate someone in being shomer it because of his obligations that he already has. So for example, in the sugya that the Chazon Ish is explaining, which Michal Yehuda brings the Chazon Ish for, where we're talking about a gabait stoko giving over what is entrusted with him, he says since the gabait stoko has responsibility for the distribution and the safekeeping, even if technically we can't be mechayev him shomrim, but that itself gives him what the Chazon Ish calls the koyach of a nifkad. There is a reshus which the chayfetz is in the hands of the nifkad. Memele zot the Chazon Ish, you can be ma'amid someone to carry out the functions of the reshus which you have, which obviously gets us into a much broader shaila of the sugi of shomer shemos al shomer, where the Chazon Ish analyzes with this yisoid the machlokes harishonim. Can the shomer be ma'amid someone else to be shomer for him, or he's always the shomer of the rishon? Zot the Chazon Ish, l'chora the shomer himself has a chiyuv achrayas. That opens the sugya of whether or not the second shomer becomes the shomer of the rishon or becomes the shomer of the baalim. Because again, zot the Chazon Ish, there's a concept of the schus of a nifkad, that where the chayfetz is with him with certain dinim, that allows him to then be ma'amid a shomer based on his din of nifkad. So to summarize, we have the following. We asked from two sugyas benegeya to the dinim of establishing shmira on the gufa adam. The first sugya was a sugya in Bamitzia Daf Nun Ches lishmor esaktanim, and the Rishonim seem to be mavur that the Shakla V'Tarav of the Gemara doesn't focus on lishmor esaktanim, but is focused on lishmor esazroim. Seemingly, the Rishonim accept that there's a concept of shmira on the katan. The question then is, what schus moment does an av have a kaponim b'bnoi in order to be able to establish moment? V'loi oid. In that case, we're not speaking about chiyuvei shomrim towards the father. We're speaking about chiyuvei shomrim towards the gizbar of hekdesh, who has the children under his care to raise them for the ma'aseh. The gizbar is not even the av. So to answer that, we have two approaches. We either have the approach of the Stipler, that since Hekdesh has an interest and there would be a loss to Hekdesh if something would happen to the child, that allows a limited bailus, which allows the establishment of Shmira. Or we have the Lashon of the Chazon Ish, where the Chazon Ish says there's a concept of a nifkad. There's a concept of someone a chayfetz has been given over to his rishus. And someone who is a nifkad can then transfer that status of nifkad to a shomer on what was nifkad by him. And Mimele, Zok the Chazon Ish, The same way as we find the sugya that there's a nidin of gizboros on moist tzedakah, even though the gizbor has no schus in them, but they are nifgad with him, he's entrusted with moist of tzedakah, anan yad aniyim anan, therefore zot the Chazon Ish, a nifgad can establish chiyuv v'shemer. Once we've... Correct. We mentioned that before, and we find that din by Akum. We find that din by Akum. That's a Rashi in Yevamis and the Rishonim that say that din we find by Akum. That an Akum owns his bondim le'inyan to be moicher them than Eved, but an Av doesn't own benoi to be moicher and be'eved. Only bitay la'oma, the Chasam Sofer says. I'm sorry? A goy. Yeah, that's true. But when Yisrael ben Yisrael. Yeah, all right. So we mentioned that before, that it's possible that we can analyze the din mitzad the din of Kaidem Matan Torah. Let's get. Yes. Correct. Because the only interest Correct. That's correct. Possibly, but what we said is that and this is what we're coming to now. We mentioned that just before. What this Chazon Ish and Stipler allows us to do is then to establish what interest someone would have in the nezek of someone else in terms of their own hefsed, and that would allow them to establish shmira. So now we can broaden the nidin to other shilas, which we mentioned in the introduction. A caretaker towards an adult. A child who's taking care of an elderly parent, or someone who's incapacitated and there's a carer. Now, the chiyuv to care for a parent would be midin kibud av. Now, even though ordinarily that's mishal av, not mishal ben, but if the av isn't able to, then the many days in the poskim that the ben then does have to provide. Or mitzad stokah, he would have a din of karav koidem to provide for his father. Now, in that case, if that child, whatever, or any the karav who's the caregiver, would then give over and entrust the care to a certain person, could we then again say that there would be chiyuv v'shomrim? Because lu yitzuya, that person chas v'sholom would become ill, or the care would be mismanaged. That would then involve expense. Similar to what the Stipler says, that we don't even need necessarily financial loss. It could be just simply toirach. Hektish to bring more children doesn't necessarily involve expense. It's toirach of being able of losing what one has begun and having to start the process again of establishing children, being shema the ktanim b'tayra, which the Stipler says is a Gemara Mufureshes allows us to establish shmira. So could we then extend that and say that a godel who is under the care where someone else is obligated in their well-being, whether it's mitzad kibud av or mitzad staka, if they then entrusted the care to another person, do we say that because they have an interest then, that allows them to establish chiyuv shmira? And here there would be a nafkamina. In the way the Chazon Ish understood what allows you to establish shmira is because you have the status of a nifgad, then yesh lodun, by a godoil, can a godoil under someone else's care be a nifgad? And here we'll have to come back to the shaila of the Mordechai, is it shaykh to be mashal gufay? But according to the Stipler, where there's an interest, and therefore that interest establishes the right to establish shmira, to prevent loss of that interest, then according to the Stipler, it's very possible that a godel entrusted to the care of another godel, which establishes an obligation, whether it's medinate stock or kibbud av, would allow that person to then obligate a shomer on what would on for chiyuv shmira on the person to whom they have that responsibility. And but only these are inyanim stumim, which we don't find lehedya discussed by the gedolei achronim in such applications. We had the chasam sofer of giving over a daughter, but the concept of whether or not a godoil could do that is unclear. And by extension, if a person is hospitalized themselves, Is it only the question of the Mordechai and the Ramban, like the Radvaz says, if a person can be mashal asatzmoi and create chiyuvei shmir on himself? Or could we also invoke svaras, like the Stipler svara, that where a person wants to be cared for, he can then give over, so to speak, that responsibility to someone else and be obligated mitzad dinei shomrim, which then opens up an enormous area of liability. Because if we understand, like the Ramban, that there isn't a possibility of an Adam being mashal asatzmoi, so then as the Ramban says, it's only an issue of groma ben azakim. But if we can establish chiyuvei shomrim based on an interest, then we can already establish chiyuvei pshia, which doesn't require satisfying the criteria of Adam Amazik or groma. So again, do we have the possibility of a person being mafkid themselves in terms of shmira? So just to finish this segment of the limud with a maramokim niflo. B'toich dvarov, the Machne Ephraim in Hilchas Nizkei Momoin explains that the sugin hameniach, which the Olam will remember from Daf Yomi and Daf Lamed Beis, the sugin hameniach of mazik ishtoi betashmish hamita. Zog the Machne Ephraim, the Baal has a chiyuv of soicher on the guf of the isha. And therefore he has chiyuvei shomrim, and therefore the reason why his chayiv is midin chiyuvei shomrim, and he's a shomer socher kimin shenene. Azay steht in Machne Ephraim and Hilchas Shomrim. Memele lechura, what we see is that in such a case, the Machne Ephraim is saying essentially that we have a gemara mefureshes, that the mokum, that there is some dual interest, then there's a din of being nimsal l'shmir. Azay steht in Machne Ephraim. The chiyuv, he's coming to answer the stira between the isha who's sheveres chafetz in Bais, that she's potter because it's considered ba'al avimoy, and the din of mazik atzma b'tasha shamito, where the Gemara establishes chiyuv. And essentially the chiddush of the Machne Ephraim is, and again, the Machne Ephraim is in Nizkei Momen and Simen Hey, is that essentially the isha skura to the Baal, and there's chiyuv and mitzvah pshia. He's trying to analyze why because if you have Ba'al Avimoy, then there's Rishonim that hold that there's a P'tur of Even Mazik. So in Mela that's what he's trying to avoid, the Rambam and the Ravid. Isn't? Yeah, Achnasa l'Rishusay. Yeah, Achnasa l'Rishusay. Achnasa l'Rishusay, Chuppah. Yeah, and a Chanami. The what? The? In terms of what? In terms of the soldier giving himself over to the authority and allowing himself to be used. But we in Balavima we had in Nidden. If the Bailam themselves are the Gufa Dover, then we had at least a Machlekes Arishonim according to the Sheretz Yosef in the Dinam of Balavima. So Homios in these Nekudas it remains Dvarim Stumim how to Lamaisa impose. Just to mention briefly, Benegeya to the Sugya in Bava Basra. Just to leave the Olam with, as we transition from Divrei Halacha to Divrei Agoda, it's difficult to know what to clearly say in the Sugya in Bava Basra. There was one suggestion, possibly B'nai Noach Koydem Matan Torah, and therefore there's a schus of Av B'nai. Can we use the fact that Yaakov Avinu would have lost the second ben of Rachel to say that ruchnius dike hefsed is enough to establish as the stipler's interest to establish Dinei Shomrim? How much of an interest do we need? Is it Toirach beguf and Momen, or what's the monetary value? V'tzarechim. Just as a suggestion, it's davar sosum. How exactly to understand what the koyach of Yaakov was to create an arvos on Binyamin? Priceless. Homios. This concludes Be'ezer Hashem this section of the limud, where we've established from the Gemara in Bava Metzia Daf Nun Ches Lishmar Es HaKoton. We've mentioned the Machne Ephraim, Mazik Ishmael V'Tashmish Hamita as a chiyuv based on the Isha being schura, and the Hanoah, which the Bahi Hanoah, which creates the chiyuv of Shem Yisachar, and therefore the nafkiminas which the Machne Ephraim uses based on that in understanding why therefore the Baal is chayiv. Just to finish with Divrei Agoda. This year the ability to be Omel B'Torah in Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh, beyond what we've been zeicha to in all the years of the Avir there at Yisrael and the Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim and all that gives us. But this year has an additional poignancy, and that is our being here is being mishtatef b'tzaros and shel Yisrael and being noiseh ba'oil with the difficult situation of Achenu Yeshvei Eretz Yisrael. There's a familiar Gemara in Yevamos, which Rabbi Ephraim Bardiansky in the Sefer Binyan Ephraim, the Chelek HaGadah, just recently republished, gives us a very, very profound understanding of a familiar Gemara. The Gemara is discussing the way in which a ger undergoes a process the process of gerus. Ger shebo lizgayer bizman hazeh oimrim lo maro iso sheboso lizgayer. What's motivating you to become a ger? Iato yoidea, don't you know sheyisrael bizman hazeh dvuyim, dechufim, schufim, meturofim v'yisurim ba'im aleim? Don't you know that Klal Yisrael is a battered ummah? Im omar yoideani, if he says, I know that. And then the Gemara adds the following words. Ve'eni kedai. And I'm not worthy of being part of that Klal Yisrael. Mekablim oisay miyad. Zot Rashi. What does Eini Roy mean? Says Rashi, Ve'eni Roy lishtatef b'tzorosam. I'm not Roy to be mishtatef, to be part of the tzar of Klal Yisrael. Umiyitein ve'ezkelekach. Were it only to be that I would merit to be part of the tzara of Klal Yisrael. Is this a positive part of Klal Yisrael? We want to ger to state that he wants to be zoiche to the Yisurim of Klal Yisrael. So Rabbi Ephraim Bardiansky says like this. He says, it's kedai to just read his lashon because it's such a lashon nifla. He says, lihikolel begoyrel Yisrael, to include oneself in the fate of Klal Yisrael, v'loy lifrosh min hatzibur beis tzarosam, and not to withdraw from the tzibur in the time of tzara. Ma rav chelkom, how great is the chelek shala'isim came to those who can do that. He says, halo yesh li Yisrael chelek roshi ba'olam bepirsum yichud shmo yizbarach. Klal Yisrael takes the primary role in publicizing yichud Hashem in the world. Zok there. V'zeh nasa, and that's accomplished loirak al yedei Torah mitzvahs. It's not just through the magnificence of Klal Yisrael being the Am Hashem keeping Torah mitzvahs. Elogam al yedei gilgulei goyrel ha'umah. Klal Yisrael is at its most magnificent during an Esav Tzara. And that Klal Yisrael, and how Klal Yisrael is Be'ez Tzara, is part of Klal Yisrael's mission of establishing Yichud Hashem Ba'olam. And therefore he says, Hatzor imam Be'ez Tzara. Someone who participates in the Tzara of Klal Yisrael, Naset Sinar Lahashpa Gedoyla. He becomes a vehicle to also be able to express that Yichud Hashem that's revealed through the Tzara of Klal Yisrael. V'zehu mamar hager eini kedai. That's what the ger means when he says that I'm not ro'ui, I'm not worthy of being that sinar. To be zoiche, to be part of Klal Yisrael b'tzorosam is at least as great, if not greater, than being mishtatif in the gedula of Klal Yisrael through Torah and mitzvahs. When we say to the ger, Zot Rashi, the way Rabbi Ephraim is teaching it, niflo, when we say to him, Iato yedeya she Yisrael bezman hazeh dvuyim uschufim, we're asking him, can you live with that reality, that Klal Yisrael being dovui and sochuf is their magnificence? It's not a b'di eved. That's the gedula of Klal Yisrael. That's where it's expressed. And the ger has to acknowledge that and say, Eini kedai, v'halavai she'ezkel lekach. This is what we can take, says Rabbi Ephraim, from this Rashi. Straightforward, Gemara Mefuresh as a din. Because like he says, B'lashoni hanifla, he says, Nasa lo yirak al yidei Torah mitzvahs el gam al yidei gilgulei goyrel ha'umah. Hatzar imam be'ez tzarosam naset sinor lahashpa gedoyla. we can come and recognize that the Eist Sorrow, which we are zeicha to be mishtatif in, is being mishtatif in the time where Adarabah is bringing out part of Klal Yisrael's role in Pirsum Yichud Shmo Yisbarach. If we're able to be zeicha, then we will mis'ala to become a chelek of that sinor of Hashpah Gedolah. We began with the Divrei Soyrus from Rabbeinu Yoina and Shar Shlishi, and we'll end with the Lashon of Rabbeinu Yoina. Rabbeinu Yoina says, the entire purpose of a person, Alei Adomis, is to be a tzir neman, l'avodos Yisbarach. To be mefarsim shmoi ba'olam. By coming here and being mishtatev b'tzarosam shel Yisrael, we were zeicha to become a tzinor la'hashpah gedolah. We should be zeicha, every one of us, to take that tzinor of hashpah gedolah, actualize it, live it, be mis'ala from it. So be'ezer Hashem, we should take a be zeicha to see Yeshuasam shel Yisrael b'karov, b'bias goyel tzedek, m'hir b'yameinu, amen.